Hello, my name's Laura Schmidt. I'm a production specialist with Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers. Today we'll briefly walk through Soybean Cyst nematode. What we'll cover today is kind of why we should care about this destructive pest, where it is, how to look for it, and then some management options that we can keep in mind moving forward. First of all, there are many kinds of nematodes living in soils. Most are not parasitic, they inhabit the water around soil particles, and they play a role in decomposing organic matter. They'll feed on bacteria, algae, or even each other, depending on the species. The plant parasitic nematodes are the ones we know the most about, since they're actively robbing crop nutrients. 100 cubic centimeters is the amount of soil commonly used when measuring nematode populations. You'll see this throughout this presentation. 100 cc's of soil. That's just under a half cup of soil. And that half cup of soil from the field might contain several thousand nematodes. So today we're going to be specifically looking at soybean cyst nematode, which is one of the plant parasites. You're going to see Dr. Mario Tenuta's name on quite a few of these slides. We're really fortunate to have Dr. Tenuta at the University of Manitoba actively researching and monitoring SCN and other nematodes here in Manitoba, and you'll see some of his research here today. This is a snippet of the disease scouting calendar for soybeans, covering the time of the growing season across the top of this chart, and then diseases are color-coded based on their impact on yield and production, with those darker colored diseases typically being worse. Soybean cyst nematode is along the bottom here. It's infecting soybeans throughout the growing season, and the impact on yield can be quite high. It is considered the #1 disease threat to soybean yield on our continent, and it's far surpassing root rots and other diseases in that respect. SCN is soil-borne, and it's infecting roots. A quick note, anything that's going to move soil will move SCN as a result. So on the picture on the right, the cysts are these small white lemon-shaped bumps on the roots. By comparison, your soybean root nodules are quite a bit larger. Here are some labels to circle those differences. SCN is considered a silent yield robber, though, since initially yield loss will occur without any above ground symptoms. And it's not until you have really high populations in the soil that you start to see those above ground symptoms popping up. You also might see those above ground symptoms if there's large environmental stressors, like if it's been very dry or something else is impacting the crop. You might see that a little bit earlier if SCN is already robbing plant nutrients. Because SCN does directly impact yield by stealing crop nutrients from the plant, and also indirectly since it's damaging root material. That's limiting water uptake. It's also creating wounds for root rots to come in and infect. Briefly walking through SCN life cycle, those nematodes hatch from eggs once the soils warm up, and they head to soybean roots. They burrow into the roots to feed and mature. Female nematodes stay in the roots and keep feeding. That female gets so large, she bursts out of the root. She's producing eggs. The first 100 or so eggs are laid into the soil directly, and then the females themselves fill up with another 200 to 300 eggs. Those females die, and their hardened bodies full of eggs become the characteristic cysts we see on soybean roots with this disease. So in warm soils, this generation might be completed in 24 days. In the US, they have anywhere from 3 to 6 generations in a single growing season. Here in Manitoba, thanks to some cooler soils and a shorter growing seasons, 2 or maybe 3 generations in a season is a bit more likely. If we look at those cysts under the microscope, each cyst is an adult female nematode again, and under field conditions, she'll contain up to 250 eggs on average. So the eggs in the cyst survive really well in the absence of a soybean host, and they can lie dormant for more than 10 years in the soil in a field. Those egg numbers, though, do decline without a soybean crop in the field, but they're never gone completely. Some of those eggs will lie dormant. And while this sounds like a lot of eggs, the literature has also reported anywhere between 90 to 99% mortality under field conditions. So even with that mortality, though, these egg numbers can really amplify quickly in the field. Just to walk through that, a quick example on that, let's take a look at a potential scenario in a Manitoba field. Say we start the year with one cyst containing 250 eggs in a soybean field. With 97% of those eggs dying off each cycle, only half of those eggs hatching to females, so 50-50 boys and girls, and 3 generations of this nematode's life cycle in the summer, what do we end up with? So each generation, we're taking those factors into account. 3% are surviving, half are female, and they're each producing another 250 eggs. That's amplifying this single cyst to just over 13,000 eggs in the soil. But what does that egg number mean, though, for yield? It's actually quite hard to equate the number of eggs you have in the soil, that SCM population, and what its direct impact on yield is going to be, since a lot of other factors come into play, especially around environmental factors that might be influencing this. If there's other stressors, what's going on in the soil. But I did find a source that at 10,000 eggs per 100 cubic centimeters of soil, that half cup of soil, soybeans might already experience 50% yield loss. So just 1 year, and this is amplified to a pretty destructive problem. There are some caveats with this. In this scenario, this would just be a localized spot in the field. It would just be a small patch. So it would take more time for this patch to spread throughout the field. The nematodes themselves aren't moving very far on their own power. It will take some time for equipment to move soil throughout the field, and SCN as well. And it's also a lot more likely we'll only see 2 generations in a Manitoba summer, and that mortality might look a little bit higher here. But we're working with a lot of unknowns in how this pest will behave here, and we're taking some kind of educated guesses. Where is SCN? So each colored piece of this map is an infected county in the States, and we can see it moving and expanding into Canada over time. SCN's expansion over the years has followed soybeans. It's not a question of if we'll be managing SCN, it's a question of when we'll be managing for SCN in our fields. Dr. Mario Tenuta and his lab have been actively surveying for SCN, anticipating its arrival in Manitoba. Through those survey efforts, SCN was first confirmed here in 2019. Populations that were found were really low, with no visible above ground symptoms. This would kind of be an example of the earliest detection possible. In 2021, 2 years later, however, SCN's known range in Manitoba expanded as a field with much higher cyst levels was found by an agronomist. So this field had visible above ground symptoms, many cysts were easy to spot on soybean roots, and it's really illustrating how SCN is likely lurking undetected in many Manitoba fields. We need to start looking for this pest, digging up soybean roots to look for these little cysts. It's worth mentioning here that we're also starting another round of survey efforts with Dr. Tenuta this upcoming year and the year after, and you can sign up your fields to participate in this survey. What's on the horizon for SCN in Manitoba? Where are the riskiest fields? So this is a map of Manitoba and North Dakota combined. The colored layer on this map are different watersheds, different shared watersheds. So orange is everything that's draining into the Red River Basin. SCN moves in with soil, and water is one of those ways that soil is moved. So annually, North Dakota has a program where farmers can test their fields for SCN for free, thanks to their commodity organization. In return, they get this data anonymized, and they map it over time. NDSU does this on their behalf. So each of these points on the map is a field average population of SCN. For them, it's worth noting anything in gray is considered inconclusive due to those other nematodes that are in the soil. For us, though, anything in gray is actually a low-level positive, since we've had that confirmed with Dr. Tenuta's lab using molecular methods. We can confidently say that is SCN infecting those fields. Yellow and red dots, those are full fields averaging more than 10,000 eggs per half cup of soil per 100 cc's of soil. So that's the situation where we're going to be rotating away from soybeans for a few years to let it cool off and to draw those populations down. So green and blue, we would be using SCN-resistant soybean varieties and other management methods, but we're still hopefully with those getting a profitable soybean crop using our management tools. The takeaway, though, that I do want to show here is that the situation upstream on the Red River is getting worse, and the number of these high cases that are being detected are moving northward, along with resistance to our varietal resistance. So SCN is likely already here in fields along this watershed due to those shared pathways, and it's likely lurking undetected in many fields. In fields that SCN hasn't been in so far, it likely will be soon. So on the left is a NASA image of the normal situation of the Red River and its basin from 2020 spring. And then the right is spring from 2022, last year. The Red River overflowed onto many of those fields in North Dakota with those excessively high numbers of SCN eggs and populations, and then it carried on up to us to overflow onto many of our fields. It is worth mentioning that's just soil movement with water that we've been talking about. Just because your field didn't flood doesn't mean you don't need to be looking for this pest or that you're safe from it. Other things can move soil. Equipment will move soil, soil sampling, different farmers, fields, birds can move soil, shoes can move soil. They all have the ability to spread soil-borne pests if we're not taking the proper protocols to get that soil off before we change fields and move between farms. So we should actively look for SCN this upcoming year in our soybean and dry bean fields. The most common above ground symptoms will actually be a healthy looking field, especially as this pest is getting established. We won't see above ground symptoms unless the crop is under water stress from dry, sandy, coarse soils, or SCN numbers are really high in that field. So what we want to do is in midsummer, late July and August, digging up soybean roots. And we want to be digging, not pulling, because the cysts will be stripped from the roots otherwise. We need to do it quite gently. With clay soils, especially, we're also going to need to soak roots to remove soils, to look for these small little cysts on the roots. The cysts are large enough to see them with the naked eye, but here a hand lens or a magnifying glass will come in handy to help you look. When above ground symptoms are starting to show up, plants will be stunted, chlorotic, and would look pretty similar to drown-out patches or IDC patches that the plant never really grew out of. So the picture on the left is that 2021 field where an agronomist found higher populations of SCN. Since it was a dry year, if this was a sandier soil type, these above ground symptoms were visible, and that was due to that limited water uptake that plants couldn't take it up because of the damaged root mass, so leading to this chlorotic stunting. Under its own power, SCN can't move very far. Even with tillage, distribution in a field is pretty patchy. So this is a satellite view of that field from the previous slide, and it's overlaid with a heat map of SCN distribution in the field. So it looks like here, based on some of the samples that have been taken, it moved in at the southern field edge off of this road to the south, and then has been kind of spread throughout the field with equipment moving soil around. So we end up with these kind of aggregated patches where we're seeing more nematodes in some areas and some areas of the field that have no infestation yet. This table is the results of a specific grid sampling taken along this rectangle along the road where those symptoms were quite visible in that picture. So they went in and sampled every 6 meters into the field and then 10-meter spacings. And what we can really see from this is that there's this red patch where numbers are really quite high. So these are egg numbers per 100 cc of soil per half cup. And we can see that they're quite high here, but they're also tapering off pretty quickly as we move into the field. So it is really illustrating that aggregated distribution. It will take more time for this to kind of spread beyond patches. So knowing that it's quite patchy, where should we be scouting for SCN right now? So if we have fields with lots of soybean or dry bean history or both mixed in fields with more than 3 years of those crops, we want to start digging up roots later in the summer. The risk areas we want to target are generally poor yielding areas of the field. So the first place to start would be headlands and approaches. Coming in on soil with equipment, that's a place to check. Previously flooded areas and low spots coming in with soil movement with water, that's another spot to look. SCN also likes high pH, so checking those zones of the field. And then you can also look along fence lines and near buildings or storage areas. Another place to check since that's where birds will land and leave soil behind. But since SCN is just getting established here, prevention and early detection are key. So prevention means being aware of soil movement between farms. We want to clean soils off of equipment, vehicles, and soil samplers between farms. It might not always be feasible to do this between fields within a single farm, but if you're moving soil between farms and between fields, there is a risk of spreading those soil-borne pests, and it's not just SCN that's a soil-borne pest. So we also want to ensure that any new to us equipment is cleaned of soil before putting it in the field, especially if it's coming up from the States. And then early detection really means making digging up roots a routine scouting activity later in the summer. Keep an eye on those fields that had floodwaters move in as well. But just because it didn't flood, remember, it's still worth looking. And then if you are finding cysts, let's get them confirmed for you. So to do so, you can contact myself, Laura, at MPSG. You can contact Dennis Lang at Manitoba Agriculture, or you can contact Dr. Mario Tenuta at the University of Manitoba. And we'll come collect some samples and we can take them to the lab, use those molecular methods, and find out what's going on. Once SCN is established and visible on roots in the field, those population numbers can be monitored by commercial soil tests. To do that, we're collecting 15 cores from every 20 acres of the field, taking the top 8 inches of soil, 1 inch in diameter. AgVise has an SCN soil test, and it reports egg numbers in your field. That report, though, is only going to be as good as the soil collected for the test, and there are a few different methods you can employ. The first is zigzag sampling. You can also sample different zones, or targeted sampling would be the third method. So right now we are looking at early detection, which would be kind of number 3, looking specifically at those high-risk areas of the field. Also, at low populations, soil tests might miss SCN. So just because you've received a negative result, that's not a definitive answer that SCN isn't present, just because it might have gotten missed. Those cysts are quite small. So that's illustrated here in these 2 photos. So the soil probe tip in this scenario is 1 inch in diameter, and you can see even just moving that probe over ever so slightly, you miss that little patch of cysts. Those soil test numbers are also quite variable, just since SCN distribution is so aggregated and patchy, and those cysts are so small. They're also kind of easy to miss with a probe. So reports, though, will provide you with a rough estimate of numbers in a field, and you can use that as a guide over time. If you start with high numbers, you can use that as a tool to see if you're actively able to bring those numbers down over time, and get kind of a baseline level with what you're working with. You can also do some things to improve the likelihood that you'll capture those cysts, and that's targeting the soybean rows either in season or targeting that root zone that's in that row post-harvest as well when you're taking samples. In terms of management, we do have SCN-resistant soybean varieties. This information is reported each year as part of the regional variety trial results in MPSG's variety guide, as well as Seed Manitoba. This last year, in 2022, nearly half of all varieties tested in the herbicide-tolerant trials contained some level of SCN resistance. They were either a yes or a no, and 50% of those, 46% of those were yeses. Here's a photo from Ontario just showing that difference that a resistance variety can truly make in an SCN-infested field. So the sunken patches in this photo, those are varieties without resistance, and then the rest of the field has the resistance worked in. And you can see it's making a pretty big difference here, and we're seeing the difference it can make in above ground symptoms. However, of those SCN-resistant varieties, it's also just a single source of genetic resistance, PI88788. And this is a problem developing. So there are a few other sources of genetic resistance available, but they typically have a bit of a yield drag as a trade-off. And what they're finding in the States is that now SCN is starting to overcome this source of resistance. And it's happening here too. We're on the way. So, resistance testing of SCN populations in Manitoba indicate that they're on their way to overcoming that PI 88788 source of resistance. So, a female index, that's what we're using to determine how much nematodes are reproducing on a specific variety or different crops. So a female index over 10% is when we would say that resistance has broken down. So the population in Manitoba that Dr. Tenuta had tested had a female index of 4.2%, which is still considered resistant. In this map of the states on the right, though, these percentages are the amount of fields where the SCN population has overcome the PI 88788 source of genetic resistance. And that's over that 10% female index. North Dakota isn't listed here, but it is about a third of the SCN populations in the southeast part of their state that has overcome resistance. So for us here in Manitoba, this resistance does still work for now, but it's good to keep in mind that this might not always be the case. Crop rotation is a main option for bringing those cyst numbers down. If we're rotating away from susceptible crops, SCN numbers can be brought down by 55% in one weed-free non-host crop year. So highlighted here, soybeans, dry beans, peas are host crops among others. And that weed-free piece is pretty critical. 116 weed species have been reported to host SCN. I've highlighted a few of them on this slide, but there are many others. So water hemp is a real challenge in terms of herbicide resistance, but it's also a host for SCN. Canada thistle, biennial wormwood, and smartweed all cracked the top 20 most common weeds found in last year's Manitoba Weed Survey in 2022. There are also several others that pop off the page. Fleabanes, chickweeds, stinkweed, portulaca, shepherd's purse, and wild mustard, along with a lot of members of the legume family. So weed management will have repercussions here to keep in mind. Jumping to another SCN host crop, dry beans are a susceptible host. So these are pinto beans grown in pots containing different SCN egg populations. So the center is a healthy plant. There's no SCN in that soil. On the left is a soil population that's 5,000 eggs per 100 cc of soil, and on the right is 10,000 eggs. So in this experiment, at 5,000 eggs per 100 cc's of soil, these pinto beans experienced 50% yield loss already. And then at those even higher levels, beans were incredibly stunted, hardly any pods, very negatively impacted. And this was work done by Dr. Yan and Dr. Nelson at NDSU. Following that, Dr. Yan and Dr. Nelson have also done greenhouse studies of different dry bean varieties to test their resistance to SCN. So again, female index is how this is measured, and that's what's reported along the y-axis here. Anything below 10%, this green line is considered resistant, since SCN isn't increasing or surviving really well on those plants. Anything above 10% is kind of varying amounts of susceptibility to SCN, with 10 to 30 being moderately resistant, 30 to 60 moderately susceptible, and anything over 60% is considered susceptible. So kidney beans and Great Northerns, those were the most susceptible in this study, with pintos, navies, and black beans falling kind of in the middle. There is a lot of variability, though, among varieties within market classes. So if I break that down further, looking at the specific varieties that they tested, you can see that there's a lot of range going into each of these averages for the different market classes. If we look at pinto beans on the left, windbreakers and vibrants are moderately resistant. If we compare that to La Paz or ND Palomino, quite a bit more susceptible. In black beans, Eclipse is especially susceptible, while Blacktails and Zorro are more moderately resistant. And then if we look especially at pink panther kidney beans, those are the worst hit with nearly 80% female index, quite susceptible. And it's worth mentioning here in dry beans, there's no specific genetic source of resistance that's been bred into these beans. This is just inherent different tolerances and how they're responding differently to SCN. So there's certainly more research needed in dry beans to understand the impact on this crop and different management tools we can use. But to summarize, managing SCN, once it is established in a field, it can't be removed, only managed. Once SCN is present, the whole goal is going to be to limit the amount of eggs and cyst numbers so that they're low enough during the soybean years of your rotation that you're still producing a profitable crop. So that starts with soil samples to know your numbers and determine risk, and then rotating to non-host crop and controlling host weed species. When soybeans are grown again, SCN-resistant varieties need to be used, and we need to rotate those SCN-resistant varieties year to year. There are different ways that those SCN-resistant soybean varieties are conferring resistance, despite all being from the same source. So there is value in rotating among those SCN-resistant soybean varieties. For tillage, we should be reducing that to limit the spread of SCN both within the field and to other fields, minimizing soil movement. And then there are also nematode protectant seed treatments, but they are not likely to provide season-long protection, and they do need further testing, which is hopefully something we'll have underway with Dr. Tenuta this year and the next, looking into some of those seed treatment options and assessing their impact on yield. A few resources to be aware of are from the SCN Coalition. This is a great resource themselves. So they have a video library as well as different fact sheets that come in handy for all things SCN. For Manitoba specific information, we do try to keep the manitobapulse.ca website up to date with any new research updates for SCN, as well as the current Manitoba situation. Before I let you go, I do want to talk about SCN's partner in crime, sudden death syndrome, which is a root and stem disease. So this disease is infecting roots. It's getting in through those wounds that SCN has created, but symptoms do show up above ground after flowering. So the symptoms are this leaf mottling, where the leaf veins remain green, and then the spaces between the veins turn yellow and then eventually die off. So sudden death syndrome hasn't been confirmed in Manitoba yet, but we do think we've seen cases of it here already. We just haven't gotten that lab confirmation. So if you do see this and want to get samples tested, make sure you're also taking the roots with the sample, since that's where the pathogen is living. It's down infecting the roots. It's the symptoms we're seeing above ground. And also, if you're seeing this, be aware that it is likely working in concert with SCN. So in summary, SCN is here, and it's also probably lurking in many fields undetected. We do need to be gently digging up roots in mid to late summer from those poor yielding areas of the field to look for those cysts. Early detection and prevention are going to be key, and let's think about soil movement to limit the spread of soil-borne pests. We do have resistant varieties for now, and if you're concerned, you can work those SCN varieties into your crop rotation already. But do know that unless we have new varieties coming to market down the line with those other sources of genetic resistance worked in, this won't be a complete solution in the long term. And we're going to need to keep researching and further develop management options for this pest. The final note I wanted to include is that along with other SCN research efforts, Dr. Mario Tenuta's lab is conducting another round of SCN surveillance in Manitoba fields this year and next year. So if you do have a field with more than 6 years of soybean history and would like us to come survey for SCN, please do reach out. Our contact information is listed on this slide. So you'll get the results from your field and we'll take care of the rest of the work. Appropriate biosecurity protocols will of course be followed. So if you're curious, the biosecurity protocol for SCN is essentially zero soil transfer. So cysts will survive bleach or spring 9. So pressure washing and booties are really the way to go, making sure we're not tracking the soil field to field. With that, thank you for your time today. Here's my contact information on the screen, as well as where you can find some more information coming from the pulse growers. And this is a pest that we care quite a bit about and want to keep on top of. So if you have any questions or want to have your field surveyed, please do reach out.